So along came my planning for my free birth at that stage.
Hey y'all, thanks for joining me again this week on part 2 of Ashley's story. So, in this episode, we are going to talk about her free birth, but we're more so going to talk about her mindset and how she was able to actually move into believing in her body, trusting herself, getting support from her husband, and doing the hard work that it took to heal from her birth traumas. And she even talks about how she went into deeper healing. And if you followed me for any time now, then you know that I have written an inner healing course called Made Whole that you can purchase on Amazon, and it's always linked in the show notes below. It dives into deep inner healing where you can walk yourself through inner healing. It comes with a whole course and video teachings and everything that you need to walk yourself through inner healing with Christ and let Him just do the work in you that you need, because it's super important even when it comes to birth trauma. And so Ashley talks about that a little bit in her story, and we touch on that. And I just think that what Ashley did was great and that everyone needs to go through it. Every man, woman, and child. It is another passion of mine, and that's why those two areas combined of childbirth and trauma are just two passions of mine that I get really excited to talk about, not because we go through trauma, but because of the healing and just what I'm designed to teach and how I'm designed to grow with Christ. And so go check that out if you're interested in it. Otherwise, we're now going to talk about the Beta Founding Members Program, which is going to launch sometime in February when I come back postpartum. And you can check out the sales page below so that I'm going to update the dates as we get closer to let you know exactly what dates in February we're going to start. But get signed up now if you are in the middle of your pregnancy or you are just ready to start learning more about home birth and what it takes to just relax during pregnancy, speed your labors along, have a pleasant and blissful labor instead of a hard, agonizing labor that you have been taught to believe that you just have to go through. You don't. And so in this course, I teach you how to have an empowered home birth through education and God's word, how to hear God's voice for your birth, how to just learn from Him, sit at His feet, and let Him be your guiding source. And also some of the physical just techniques that I learned, and physically how to take care of your body. And it's just something that you need. It's something that I know everybody needs because I didn't have it with my first two births, and then I had it with my third, fourth, and fifth births. And with my third, fourth, and fifth, I just went deeper and deeper and deeper into learning and into the relaxation part of it, not in a weird way, just literally like learning to relax and learning to focus on Jesus and learning to listen to my body and understanding that as I've gone through this journey, how so many women are not taught the truth about birth. And so we talk about the truth about birth. We talk about mindset and what it means to truly believe God and what He promises for your birth. So go check it out. You need this course. I promise you it will transform your life. It will transform your births. It will transform you as a mother because you will start your journey off in motherhood the right way. So I'll see you in the podcast. Welcome to the Barefoot Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Hutton. I help Christian moms have a home birth they desire through education and the Word. If you're an old soul that is passionate about restoring godly wisdom and disconnecting from this interconnected world, then you're in the right place. Let's discuss godly restoration through the 5 H's of home: home birth, homeschool, homemaking, homemade, home remedies, and health. Wow. So I do have a couple of questions for you because that's exactly my thoughts were as you were saying, like, so then you went into a C-section because if you were already dilated to a 10, baby was descended, baby was engaged, baby was there. And that's exactly the visual that I had going through my mind was like, okay, what does that look like when you're already dilated to a 10 and baby is that far down into the pelvis? They've got to then pull the baby back up and out, to get the baby out of the pelvis. And
Yeah.
then then like you said, that's the very thing that they were worried about you giving tearing with a vaginal birth is actually what happened because you had the C-section.
Yeah, I found some. I did go on a search when I got my hospital notes, and I found that it is in the obstetrician's guidelines that they don't do C-sections on women when the baby's a certain way down, because this is one of the risks. And they said when a baby's a certain way down, that you should only perform a cesarean section if the baby can't be born vaginally, because they know that the risk is there. I mean, they were telling me, but they were never saying to me like, you can't have a vaginal birth. It was just like, we don't believe in you. We think you're going to be in it. Like, obviously, the mindset is you're going to end up in surgery anyway. So let's just get it done now while it's safer rather than wait. But what they did in my mind, and I would love to have a conversation with them,
Yeah.
but for me, it was like, you put me at risk because you didn't believe in me, or you don't understand
Mm-hmm.
physiological birth, or you don't understand posterior birth, because I had a posterior baby, and my baby had come down a little bit further than what they had actually told me as well. So when I looked at my surgery notes, she had come down a little bit, like one more station. But I imagine she was further down than they had actually put on the notes,
Yeah.
because they actually didn't mention anything about a cervical lip, and they said I was only 7 centimeters. So they actually lied on the paperwork as well, which means that they probably had a bit of an understanding of what they were doing.
Yeah, exactly. And
Clearly.
yeah, yeah. And we'll never know for sure. And, vaginal exams are, it's a person. And so it's up for, you know, the interpreter's interpretation of how dilated you
Yeah.
are as well. Um, and then also, just for our audience that's listening, um, you know, 10 is not this just magical number where baby just comes out either. 10 is a
No.
guideline. You're is it's when your baby comes to that point of getting when your baby's head comes to that point of the cervix, and it triggers the fetal ejection reflex and the pushing phase. And so you could be smaller than 10 centimeters, or you may need to dilate a little bit bigger than 10 centimeters. It all depends on the size of your baby's head. And when it actually gets to that point through the cervix and actually begins triggering that reflex, and then at that point, it just pushing just naturally happens, and mama takes on a whole new demeanor and a whole new sound, and everything gets really intense at that point.
Yeah, and I did start pushing as well.
Mm,
Before I'd had the epidural,
mm,
I could feel some pushing
wow.
happening. And so my experiences, because I've had posterior babies, is that I dilate really
Mm,
quickly. But what happens is the majority of my labor is actually the baby coming down. So my babies are always posterior. They're high, they're bigger. And so I dilate. My mother dilated and had my sister in two
yeah.
hours. She had me in 7, and I was the first baby. So I dilated to full within 5 hours of that first labor. And I imagine with my free birth, it was probably within 4 or 5 hours too, because I spent in my free birth at least, the next 10 hours pushing. And it wasn't pushing like every single contraction. It wasn't the fetal ejection
Mm-hmm.
reflex. It was, we're going to do like every 3 or 4 contractions, you're going to bear down and we're going to push, because your body's like turning. My body was turning and pushing the baby down because she was higher up and needed to do a lot of work to turn down to the optimal position to be born the way she needed to be born. And we don't talk about this enough, posterior birth. We talk about the normal textbook, oh, as soon as you get to 10 centimeters, your body will start pushing and your baby will be born. And that's what I thought. And I realize now that the midwife didn't understand posterior
Mm,
birth, and either did the obstetricians, because they were like, oh, the baby's up high. And it's like, well, I had a free birth with a baby up high. And guess what? My body did the work and my baby was born out my
yeah.
vagina. And I hear so many women tell me their story. And I'm like, you had a posterior birth. Like, as soon as they start telling me, I'm like,
Mm,
was your baby posterior? And they're like, yes. And I was like, exactly. Like, I know straight away, as soon as they give me a couple of things, I'm like, that's why you weren't supported to birth. That because you didn't fit the textbook birth, which does not include posterior birth, and they're actually really frightened of posterior birth.
Yeah, yeah, which is it's crazy because um, I had never really looked much into posterior birth until this last one because she was a posterior for a lot, um, and then she was born with a nuchal hand in her face. But if they're posterior,
Mm.
um, most babies turn before they actually come out, and they actually will turn a lot of the
Yeah.
times as they're coming through the birth canal, which is just amazing.
Mm. Yeah, they have to do that extra work. And so the posterior birth can be longer. It can be sometimes more, it can be harder.
Yeah.
You know, I had back labor, but that didn't really hurt me. It was more a numbing pain. My leg was numb.
Mm.
So there was different things. It wasn't the contractions as soon as, so it's, I didn't talk about my free birth, but my free birth started with my waters breaking.
Mm.
And then I went into labor 30 minutes later and it was hard and fast. It was like very, very painful. Like my last experience, waters breaking for me is very painful. And then I would have been about fully dilated around about 4 hours. And in that 4 hours, I was panicking.
Mm-hmm.
This pain was intense. How am I going to get through? It was like that transition phase that we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, I'm like, trying to assimilate to, first of all, being awake, my children being excited, running around, trying to deal with everyone's energies, my husband and my children, so excited,
Yeah.
trying to get into positions that felt okay because all of the things that worked last time weren't working. Everything felt excruciating. The yoga ball, the laying in bed, being on the toilet, all excruciating, but I had my techniques. I was breathing through it. I was using my mindset. I was using positive affirmations. I had a little birthing comb, and after about 3 or 4 hours, my husband had set up the birth pool. I was able to get in there. My children were removed. My energy started grounding. My doula came. I had that womanly support holding my hand. I was like, "Is this normal? Is this normal?" Because this is insane. Like, what crazy person goes through this? This was different to my last one because it didn't feel like that until the waters had been broken. And I don't think we talk about this enough either. I think it can be very, I've seen a few women describe it quite painful when the waters go versus it puts a lot of extra pressure on the baby when the waters go as well. And so it can be harder for the baby to turn and come down too because they don't have that comfort of being in the water and coming down. So it was a harder journey, but after that, after my body fully dilated and I started pushing, I it was peaceful. It was
Mm-hmm.
calm. My mindset was fine. I was just relaxing, floating around the pool. It was amazing. It was such an amazing experience that I just look back and think I'm so glad I had that experience.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about that to go back to how you made the decision to really free birth. Talk us through um, all the things of like, how did that even enter into your thoughts? Where did you first learn about free birth? And then I especially want to talk about the conversation you and your husband had and how he was on board with you.
Yeah. So I started to look at home birth as an option. I started training as a postpartum doula myself. I started working with women who were pregnant. I started working in this space. I started connecting with other women sharing their stories. And I knew that I could never have a vaginal birth in hospital. I looked at the options that were available to me. There were there weren't there was a midwife who was willing to support me in a hospital, but it was a couple of hours away from where I lived, and I felt that was way too far. She thought that was the most supportive hospital. I just knew that driving in a car in labor would be
Yeah.
excruciating. I'd already had that experience. And I looked at an obstetrician team with private midwives who were birthing in a hospital near me, and they said they would support me. I could have all the things that I wanted to have, but I just didn't trust the obstetrician wasn't going to do something
Mm-hmm.
sneaky. I just didn't feel aligned, and I really felt called to the home birth stuff. So I started meeting up with women who are home birthing, and I started to connect with a couple of women in home birth groups that were having VBACs, they were free birthing, and I got onto the Free Birth Society podcast. I was in their Facebook group when that was active years and years and years ago. And I started to listen to these women's stories. And I thought, oh, they're really, that's really good for them. But I don't think I could do that. That's a little bit out there for me. I'm just like a normal person. I couldn't do that, but awesome for them. And I started, yeah, I was like, nah. And then I just couldn't. And then I thought, well, I'll just have a home birth with a midwife. And then I started finding that I couldn't find anyone who would support me. There wasn't a lot of midwives available in where I live, but there wasn't a lot who would support VBAC then. I feel like it was really taboo for VBAC, let alone VBAC after two
Yeah.
cesareans. And on top of this, I also had a special scar, and I had a history of gestational diabetes, big babies, because my second baby was born 4.1 kilos, which is 9.1 pounds. And then I'm plus size too, so I'm quite big. So there's a lot of things there that their licensing and their registrations, they're getting hounded anyways, let alone taking on somebody that doesn't fit in the
Yeah.
box quota. So I started to realize that my options were quite limited, and I think I just started to surrender more to this idea of free birth. And it took me a very long time to surrender to the idea of taking the full radical responsibility of my choices. And I had to realize that there was no guarantee of me having a positive birth in hospital.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that was holding me back was the fact that if something catastrophic happened at home, I would be held responsible. Whereas if something catastrophic happened in the hospital, I could blame someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I had to realize that, I understand. I don't want to be seen as this reckless woman. I'm trying to be a reasonable woman. I want people to see me for the educated person that I was. I was more worried about the outcomes of what society would think and how society would treat me than actually worried that something would happen with my baby. I
Yeah.
wasn't really too worried that anything would really happen. I mean, there were some fears, obviously, but that was my biggest concern. And these are the biggest concerns I find with the women that I work with
Yeah.
too, because we're usually people pleasers.
Yeah.
We usually want to fit in with society. I didn't grow up my grandma had a home birth with my dad, which is cool, but it isn't something in my family that's like home birth is safe or home birth is normal. My granddad's in his 90s now, and he even said to me after my home birth, like, that was an interesting choice. Like, I'm like, your wife gave birth at home, man.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, that's right. And I was
Oh
like,
my gosh.
he
Yeah.
has so assimilated to the culture of hospital is best over that time frame. I was like, my grandma didn't want to go to hospital because she was afraid. That's where people go to die. And she was like, that's where she died eventually,
Yeah.
because that's where people go to
Yeah. What
die.
knowledge
We
she actually
don't
had.
associate that now, but that's what she associated
Yeah.
with.
What knowledge she actually
Yeah.
had.
So she ended up, was lucky. Yeah. So I just started watching Call the Midwife, which
Mm-hmm.
was a UK TV show. Have you seen
Yeah,
it?
I started watching it. I only got 2 or 3 episodes into it, with 4 kids running around, and I started watching it right after I had Harper, so last year about this time. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was really good, but I can't just it's not something I can watch with my husband because he's not really going to be interested in that. And then, you know, I can't really
Yeah.
sit down and watch TV during the day. So I would love to get back into it though because it was really good. Yeah.
So good. And also, I'm from England as well. Like, I moved here when I was 2, but my whole family's in England. That was my ancestry. And so I'm looking at these women like, this is normal. This is, it takes you through the show of some of the issues that they have with some of the medicines that they use without research, that is like testing them on people, and some of the outcomes. It's a drama series, obviously, so there's always something dramatic happening. But I thought, that just seems so lovely. Like having a midwife come to your house, have a cup of tea, have a chat. It's not a big deal. It's like community based. I just really love that whole
Yeah.
feel. So eventually, I realized that there was no other choice. If I wanted to have a home birth, it had to be free birth. And so I was listening to podcasts. I joined memberships. I joined courses. I was reading so many books. I was doing my own training and studying as a professional myself. And my husband, I would have conversations and tell him, like, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. He was listening to the podcast while he was in the kitchen, and I was in the lounge room, or we were in the car and I'd listen to them and he's in the car. He wouldn't listen to them on his own, but he was absorbing.
Yeah.
And then I would constantly tell him. And he was the one that convinced me to have the free
Wow.
birth. I was like, but how? He's like, well, it just makes sense. Like, you're a woman, you've got a vagina. Like, it's the way that women have been doing it forever. And I was like, but I've failed twice.
Mm,
And he's like, no, you didn't. They failed you.
yeah.
And I'm like, well, okay. Like, he just had deep trust and belief. Like, why wouldn't he? I'm a woman, right?
Yeah.
I fell pregnant without any assistance. I I've lived my whole life without assistance. I've not had health problems. I've not needed any assistance. So why would I need assistance so heavily? I'm not saying that we can't have some sort of assistance,
Yeah.
and I would have loved to have had assistance in case I needed somebody, and it would have been nice to have that nurturing support. But I did have a free birth doula that supported me, but she did not do any medical stuff. She was purely there for emotional support. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much how we got to the decision. It was a 3-year process before we consciously conceived our third baby. And yeah, so it wasn't something that I took lightly. It wasn't something that I just left for the fates to decide. It was something that I made sure that I had worked through majority of the trauma. I had PTSD after that birth. I was working with a psychologist for weight loss, but I was working through boundaries and all this family, childhood trauma stuff. And I was making sure that I was making the choices that were right, not from a space of trauma, but from a space of like empowerment and education and knowledge, but also because it was, in my opinion, the best and safest way for me to give birth based on all the choices that I had. The only thing that I felt that probably did a disservice to myself is that, and I understand why I felt that way, is I was very vulnerable and I felt very limited. The choices that were available didn't feel like choices to
Yeah.
me. So I wasn't looking at my choice to free birth in a powerful
Mm,
way. I was looking at my choice to free birth as a way of like, this is my only option. I felt very victimy in
mm-hmm.
that sort of way. And that really did corrode some of the enjoyment out of the whole
Mm,
process. But after getting kicked out of hospital and a lot of things that did happen to me, I can understand exactly why, it did feel like the world was against me at
yeah.
times. And I did go through a very, very painful and challenging process to get where I needed to go. And I am grateful that I got to that space because it has given me so many gifts that are going to continue through my family and my lineage. I can see, but it didn't have to be that way. I can see now that I can I've got 3 daughters, so I can teach my children the way of loving themselves and their natural cycles, and teaching all the things that I didn't have, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? So it's been a really full circle healing journey, but refining myself as in a way as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. And just great insight and intuition from yourself to know that you needed to work through that trauma and to not make decisions based off of the trauma. It's so, so important. I wrote a whole inner healing course on that too. It's called Made Whole.
Mm,
And there is just, we have a lot of science behind it now of how trauma actually affects our physical organs. And we know that it raises our cortisol levels and it causes a lot of,
mm,
physical issues and health problems going on. But there is such a spiritual side to it as well. And the emotional part of it is just extremely important. Um, and so, good job for you for doing that and taking the time to
mm,
work through all of it. I know a lot of people don't get that opportunity, or they just don't really quite have that personal
yeah.
intuition to really just go there. and work through it.
Are you enjoying this podcast? I sure hope you are. If you are, please let me and others know by leaving a review wherever you listen from. Are you interested in a topic I've covered so far and want more? Please leave a comment or message me at contact@cassiehutton.com. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Barefoot Parenting. If what you're doing works for you, is healthy for your family, and is growing you in the ways you need to grow, then it's time to step out of the feeling of guilt and shame and wear your Barefoot Mama badge proudly. Remember, barefoot parents are doing things differently, so be encouraged today. If you're feeling the pushback in your parenting style, you're doing something right.